Welcome to the third video in the series of 4 on Being Autistic, Navigating the World as an Autist. I talked in the first video about how high and low functioning autism and mild and severe autism are extremely inaccurate and misleading ways of talking about the spectrum. And I said that high and low support needs are perhaps a better way of looking at it. However, this is not as straightforward as it might seem either. On this slide are just a few of the things that we so-called high-functioning autists are still navigating day after day. I will cover them all in this video. By the end, I hope you will understand that while autism is not best seen as either a deficiency or a disorder, in this society in which we are not the predominant neurotype, it is definitely a disability. We do need support, and we do need, oh that familiar phrase, reasonable adjustments, as much as anyone with a more visible disability. Chris Bonello says, I am high functioning until I'm not. Similarly, I have low support needs because I have successfully navigated school, I have friends, I have got a degree, 2 actually, and I'm in work. I'm self-employed, successfully running my own business. Clearly, I don't need support. Well, until I do. An autistic advocate called JJ comments that by the time the mask drops, it's too late. What you do not want to happen is to discover that your autistic client, who has apparently been jogging along fine, if maybe a little erratic at attending appointments, has suddenly stopped communicating, or worse, has had a major meltdown, sometimes misunderstood as a tantrum or a panic attack, or worse still, has attempted suicide. The suicide rates among so-called high-functioning autists are disproportionately high. 3 times as high as the general population is a common figure. Successful masking or camouflaging is actually seen as a significant risk factor for suicidality. A moment's thought will make that less surprising. Suppose you could never be yourself for fear of being a burden, of being rejected, of being regarded as weird, as other, as incompetent. And then on top of that, imagine that your very success in camouflaging means that you don't get the help and support, formal or informal, that you actually need. And on top of that, imagine that because you don't get that support, you find navigating the world baffling, and you never quite succeed at anything. Well, it makes sense, doesn't it? Let that sink in. Your high-functioning, apparently low support needs autistic client is actually at higher risk of suicide than their low-functioning, high support needs sister at home, and at far higher risk than their neurotypical friend who is open about their mental health needs. You need to get in first. I've said several times that we autists are living in a society that isn't designed for us, and that life is therefore a struggle even before you factor in the co-occurring conditions. Simply because this society, this culture, isn't designed for us, we may be struggling with certain things all the time, which you will not know unless you know. There are 2 stages in the getting to know. One is the basic awareness of what might be a problem, and the second is asking the individual person and listening to what they say. I will give you some pointers today, and a fairly minor example of a failure of support and mismatch of salience in my own life. But the asking and listening can only be done with the individual. And without that asking and listening, you will not know what kind of adjustment or support is needed. Don't assume. An autistic woman of my acquaintance was outraged when, doing a degree, she was offered someone to help with her spelling and grammar. She is nearly as much of a spelling, grammar and punctuation nerd as I am. If you do not know these things, if you cannot at least make an educated guess, you may be faced with a client who, apparently out of the blue, has gone completely non-verbal, is not responding to anything that is said or done to them, or is apparently having a tantrum. A quick digression on meltdowns and shutdowns. It is very important to know that there is nothing an autistic person can do about a shutdown or a meltdown once it starts. Apologies for the reference to child in the picture in the next slide. I literally could not find a single one that did not mention children, which tells you something about how far we have not come in our view of autism. To start with meltdowns, as they are the most dramatic and alarming, they can look like tantrums, or they can look as if the person is trying to do as much damage to themselves or their environment as they possibly can. Or it can look like a panic attack. First and most important, a meltdown and a tantrum are about as different as they could be. A tantrum is used purposefully to gain control, while a meltdown is an involuntary physical and emotional reaction to a situation from which there is no perceived escape. Meltdowns have been likened to epileptic seizures, and I gather that there is research going on into this. They certainly seem to be some kind of brain event. So what can you do about it? Well, to use that Gallic idiom, listen to the mountain wind until the waters subside. Respond as you might to a major seizure. You don't restrain a person having a seizure. You don't, as people did in the old days, try to put something in their mouth to prevent them biting their tongue. You don't talk to them. What you do is make the environment as safe as you can. You will move things with sharp edges, anything that person might hurt themselves on. You might put a cushion under their head. Once the seizure is over, you might put a blanket over them. When they start to come round, you will reassure them. But you will intervene only when it is absolutely necessary to stop serious injury. An autistic person in a meltdown is already utterly overwhelmed. Almost anything you do will add to the overwhelm. A calming, quiet presence may help if you can do that. A cushion to hold, a soft blanket, turning off the lights, maybe. A shutdown is less dramatic, but it is also a response to overwhelm. Too much everything, as a friend said to me. And it is not a choice or within the autist's control. We may become non-verbal, we may appear catatonic, may seem to fall asleep, will not respond to anything. Because we can't. The mask has slipped, and for the moment we can't find the capacity to put it back on. So that's once the mask slips. To get in first, what might the specific challenges facing an autistic client, or any autist, be? I'll start with one that may not occur to you, but will probably seem obvious once I've said it. We've talked about double empathy, mismatch of salience, the so-called Chinese whispers problem, and the different processing and communication styles. Now, because our method of expression and understanding is accurate, literal, detailed and clear, we may not pick up on hints, oblique references or assumptions. We're often mystified by the unwritten rules that neurotypical people appear to be born knowing. We will also be stymied by small changes in procedure. I have been known to search until I am frazzled for an email from a student which admin has told me is in my folder. It is in my folder, but not in the folder in which these things are usually put. One of the phrases that I have constantly repeated throughout my life, since long before I knew anything about autism, is, "It may be obvious to you, but it isn't obvious to me." Do not patronize us. We are not stupid. But do check whether instructions are clear. Autistic people often have poor executive function, and most of what I will say for the rest of this session comes more or less under executive function. One element of executive function is performing tasks with many steps. If you give me an instruction in which some of these steps are omitted, I will not be able to follow the instruction. I will, so to speak, stick at the gap. If one of these small steps is changed, the same will happen. A change in the layout of a web page can be enough. If I'm stressed, a change in the font can be enough. It doesn't look as I expect it to. And so, although physically I see it, there's nothing wrong with my eyes, my brain doesn't provide the necessary interpretation of what I have seen. This is unbelievably important. It is the reason why an intelligent autist may, in one area, suddenly seem stupid, incompetent, or deliberately obtuse. That is often referred to as the spiky profile. If you are not sure that you have understood this, feel free to add a comment asking for clarification. So, one reasonable adjustment at work or at university might be an extra email with detailed instructions that neurotypical people somehow don't need, or the contact number or email of someone who will be available to talk me through something I haven't understood. Submitting assignments is a particular headache for students, not least because doing and submitting assignments is important and stressful anyway. People differ as to how many elements there are to executive function. 7, 8, 12, take your pick. For example, the capacity I've just mentioned to do a task requiring several steps. And yes, I do mean making that cup of tea, or following spoken instructions. I have a photographic memory and can memorize a route map in seconds, but please don't give me instructions as to how to get to a place. By the time you've said second right, I have forgotten first left. I think you can see how that might present a major problem in all the apparently small procedures within a university or a workplace. The way Naoki puts it is, even when I have a picture in my head of the completed task, the sequence of steps I need to take to turn that picture into reality stays unclear. This is an obvious one, maybe, but it can look like laziness or chaos. It is neither. Anecdotally, I have noticed that many autistic people, maybe all of us, perceive time in a different way from most neurotypicals. I think this statement from Damien Milton is enlightening. For me, memories are experienced as fragments, painstakingly structured and constructed to make patterns. Such patterns are movable. They shift and alter each time one attempts to view them. And Naoki says, the memory of a person with autism isn't like a number scale from which you pick out the recollection you're after. It's more like a jigsaw puzzle, where even if just one piece is misinserted, the entire puzzle becomes impossible to complete. What's more, a single piece that doesn't belong there can mess up all the surrounding memories as well. For us, time is as difficult to grasp as picturing a country we've never been to. You can't capture the passing of time on a piece of paper. The hands of a clock may show that some time has passed, but the fact that we can't actually feel it makes us nervous. For us, 1 second is infinitely long, yet 24 hours can hurtle by in a flash. Time can only be fixed in our memories in the form of visual scenes. For this reason, there's not a lot of difference between 1 second and 24 hours. So far, Naoki. Many of us simply do not experience time as linear, but fragmentary and shifting. Although we know notionally the difference between a minute, an hour, a day, we do not necessarily experience this. Again, you can see how this could be a problem in circumstances where an autistic person is living independently and having to do their own time management for the first time. Task initiation can be a problem. This is related to the previous points. If the task one has to do is hard to hold in one's memory, and the time available to do it in is fragmentary and shifting, then beginning it can feel not just daunting, but too confusing to do. Another element in this is what's sometimes called autistic inertia. One of the stereotypes about autistic people that's actually true is that we struggle with transitions. Not so much with change as with transitions. Some of us have trouble going through doors or into or out of a building. Most of us have trouble switching from one task to another. So starting a task can feel insurmountable and mystifying. This is what Naoki says. People with autism are sometimes unable to move on to their next action without a verbal prompt. For example, even after we ask for a glass of juice and are given it, we won't actually start drinking until someone said, enjoy, or go ahead and drink then. I don't really know why people with autism need these cues, but I do know that I'm one of them. Since we already know what we'll be doing next, surely we should just be able to get on with it, unprompted, right? But the fact is, doing the action without the cue can be really, really tough. In the same way as you don't walk over the crossing until the light turns green, I can't switch on the next action until my brain receives the right prompt. Doing the next action without obeying the prompt rule is terrifying. It's enough to make me lose the plot completely. Then defining and achieving goals. That question, what outcome are you aiming for, is one that we can find baffling. We are inclined to see details rather than the whole, as I mentioned earlier. Naoki again describes this beautifully. When you see an object, it seems that you see it as an entire thing first, and only afterwards do its details follow on. But for people with autism, the details jump straight out at us first of all, and then only gradually, detail by detail, does the whole image sort of float up into focus. What part of the whole image captures our eyes first depends on a number of things. When a colour is vivid or a shape is eye-catching, then that's the detail that claims our attention, and then our hearts kind of drown in it, and we can't concentrate on anything else. I suspect, though I don't know, that might be behind our tendency to write a fabulous, well-argued, well-constructed essay or article, answering a completely different question to the one asked. So we may home in on 5th century Athens and genuinely not notice that the question was, how do you see drama in the Hellenistic period as differing from that of 5th century Athens? Oh yes, it happened to me. So a student may need some extra time with a tutor to ensure that they fully understand what the question is asking, and a bit of training to apply this in exams. At work, our colleagues may need a bit of training in how to write emails clearly without distracting elements. One of the stereotypes about autistic people is that we are not creative. This is true and not true. Many of us are extremely creative in the artistic sense. We are writers, artists, craftspeople, musicians. What we're not so good at doing is doing things in a way that's not natural to us, or in a way in which we've not done it before. We may constantly, unconsciously, keep reverting to the old way. We may constantly get the new way wrong. We may become extremely stressed by the effort of doing it differently. To imagine what it's like. I love cycling, so when I went to visit my friend in Amsterdam, she lent me a bike and we went off on a tour of the city. But have a look at the picture. Do you notice anything about the bike? Look at the handlebars. Aha! Dutch city bikes don't have brakes. What you do to stop a Dutch city bike is pedal backwards. I was constantly slamming on the non-existent brakes on the handlebars, and only when I was a couple of yards away from a tram, remembering what I actually had to do to stop. I survived that tour of Amsterdam, but looking back, I am horrified. I'm sure it would have been the same for pretty much anyone. That wasn't a specifically autistic experience. I tell you this to give you some idea of what is going on in our brain when we try to do something in a way that doesn't come naturally. We are not being difficult. Another issue can be object permanence. Object permanence is the understanding that objects continue to exist even when they cannot be seen, heard, or otherwise sensed. It is something that most babies have grasped by the age of about 6 months. Now, for many autistic people, especially if they have ADHD in their profile, it's not that we don't know that the object we can't see continues to exist, but to all intents and purposes, it might as well not. We struggle to, so to speak, bear it in mind. So, for example, if I can't see a book, I could forget that I have it. If I am writing something which requires references and quotations, I will have multiple tabs and multiple documents open, and my floor will be covered with books. In common with many autistic people, I don't like chairs, preferring to sit on the floor. That could look like untidiness or clutter. It isn't. It is my need to see a thing in order to reliably remember it exists. Many autistic people can experience real distress if they cannot see the important things they own. Much as we know the things have not vanished, it feels as if they have. That can be one of many reasons why it is difficult to leave one's room or one's house, or, as above, why our room or house may appear cluttered or untidy. It can make things harder to find and slow us down, but it can also drop our level of stress, which speeds us up. I think it's becoming obvious why autistic people can struggle with organisation and planning, isn't it? And as I say, especially if you factor in ADHD, which is a frequently co-occurring condition. Context blindness. This is another stereotype which is a misunderstanding. We are told that autists do not see context, and that we can therefore behave or answer in a way that is apparently inappropriate. But what is context? What is appropriate? If you and I are looking at the same thing, but from different points of view, we will see different things. I'm a fly fisher, so I'm interested in how a river flows. Perhaps you're interested in birds. You're interested to see the oyster catchers. We're looking at the same view, but seeing different things. The effect is not unlike that of weak central coherence. Autists don't miss contexts. We are not context blind. We just don't see the same context as you, nor do you see the same context as we do. You may think it is very important that this fellow here is Lord So-and-so. I may think it is much more important that he is wearing the fishing jacket that my friend John is considering buying. Why should I care that he's Lord So-and-so, when what I want to know is whether the fishing jacket has reliable pocket linings? Another mismatch of salience. Focus is an interesting one. I mentioned special interests in an earlier video, and they are essential to the understanding of the autistic way of being. The Sunday name of focus is monotropism. Our brains seem to focus more deeply and more uniquely than does the non-autistic brain. This is bound up with the sensory differences. This focus seems to be the only way to tune out the irrelevant. With autistic inertia and difficulty with transitions, you can see why it is hard to change tack when one is so absorbed. Fergus Murray, who is the son of Dinah Murray, who was one of the first to posit monotropism as a defining feature of autism, describes it thus. It's as if we've loaded a cart to the brim with thoughts and feelings, and then we suddenly have to steer it round a sharp corner. Remember my Dutch city bike? One effect can be that our work is extremely uneven. The difference between our work and concentration when we are focused on a special interest and when we are trying to make ourselves concentrate on another random thing is dramatic. I remember this from when I was writing my thesis. I straddled 2 departments, classics and theology. Reading the historical articles and making notes on them and writing the necessary historical sections was like pulling teeth. I could read an article and remember nothing. Not only did it take me a long time to get through the article, because I was constantly pulling my attention back. It also took a longer time because I had to note down everything I needed to remember. Whereas I'd sit down to read theology for, say a couple of hours, and then come to myself blinking and notice that 7 hours appeared to have passed and that I was rather hungry. I wouldn't need to take notes either. The contents of what I was reading seemed miraculously to have transferred themselves to my brain. So all that comes under executive function. It is obvious then why we are inclined to process slowly. Few of us can easily answer a question off the cuff or when we are put on the spot. I will pause even if the answer to the unexpected question is simply my name. Unless, as above, it's a question of a special interest. This is not because we are stupid or slow as such. It is because, for one reason or another, our brains do not appear to have quite the capacity that yours do to filter out the irrelevant. Remember that slide of the autistic sensory experience? Here it is again. We hear the question. We also hear other people in the meeting shifting in their chairs, maybe whispering, coughing, clearing their throats, rustling papers. The ticking clock, the humming of the fluorescent lights. We also see the light shifting, the dust in the sun, the multiple colours, and we smell everyone's scent, aftershave, sweat, soap, the cleaning product used in the room. What was it you said? We develop ways of dealing with this. You may, for example, have an autistic client who, when asked a question, will automatically respond with, "What?" and then after a pause respond. The "what" is consciously or unconsciously to buy processing time. It doesn't mean they haven't heard, which can be definitely confusing if you start to repeat your question and they answer it halfway through. It may make all the difference to an autistic client to know that they will not be put on the spot during a session. The difference between being able to go to therapy and not being able to. I can't go into the details of sensory sensitivities here, as it would take too long, and it is different for everyone. Suffice it to say that because of this apparent lack of brain filter, an autistic person is always experiencing interference with the task in hand. Tinted glasses, ear defenders, soft clothes without labels, all these things may help. At a certain point, Edinburgh University Student Counselling Service asked all its staff not to wear perfume or aftershave because of someone's allergies. I don't think it's asking too much to make the same request because of somebody's sensory issues. I'll talk a little more about sensory accommodations in the next video once we get into the counselling room. Just one more thing before I move on to a specific example of an autistic student's experience of a mismatch of salience. I used the phrase spiky profile earlier. This is something very striking about autists. You can't predict how we will perform in one area by noting how we perform in another. And an extra confusing factor is that the more pressure we're under, the less capacity we will have to perform, even in areas where we are normally expert. Suppose a student loves exams because he has a photographic memory and is particularly skilled at pulling the necessary fact or reference out of that memory when required. And then suppose that he didn't fully understand where the exam was being held or at what time, or whether he was allowed, say, to bring a bottle of water into the exam hall or not, or the process of registering his presence at that exam. That is enough to knock that photographic memory for 6. And he doesn't have another way of doing exams. He may do dramatically less well than expected. Why? He is so good at exams. Indeed he is, but he has a spiky profile. Brilliant as he is at exams, he is not good at all at coping with unexpected admin type stuff. A person may be astonishingly confident in giving a presentation. They may be lively, smiley, their voice well modulated, making eye contact with the audience, their colleagues, even the CEO. But see that same person at a party? You will hardly recognize them, if you see them at all. A scientist may be terrifyingly competent at designing and carrying out their experiments in the lab. They may be completely at sea trying to cook more than a boiled egg. Look at me, for example. Ask me to do a talk or a workshop or to sing in Gaelic, I'll be in my element. Ask me to sit on the X95 bus from Selkirk to Edinburgh for 2 hours, next to someone wearing strong aftershave, and I will get to Edinburgh a quivering wreck, and it will take me a good 10 minutes or more to be fit to do anything. And by anything, I mean walk to my destination. As I said earlier, don't assume. I am going to give you here an example of a mismatch of salience between a student and their disability officer. It is not entirely the disability officer's fault, as the student was too recently diagnosed and too uncertain of themselves to state their exact needs. I will then suggest a couple of easy adjustments that might have made all the difference. The student was studying a language and had several times attempted to explain their slow processing and their inability to think of something to say when they had, in fact, nothing to say. That, incidentally, is one element in our struggle with small talk. When I have said, "It's raining," then I have nothing more to add, unless, of course, my special interest happens to be meteorology. The first email that you can see was sent after the student had been almost unable to talk during an oral exam. They had asked beforehand for some time to think after being given the possible subject to talk about, and had simply been told, "Oh, it's fine to take a minute or so." Well, that doesn't mean anything to your average autistic person. So this was the email. Just to say that I have no idea whether I will have to redo the oral test. Of the 3 subjects, I could only think of anything at all to say about one of them, and even so, not much. I think I said a couple of sentences and then dried, as I would have done in English. If I do have to do it again, then please, I absolutely need 5 minutes to think of something to say. As it stands, it is not a test of language at all, but a test of inventiveness. That is not what we should be being tested on. I cannot invent off the cuff for disability reasons, but some neurotypical people can't either. It is really frustrating not to be able to show off the huge progress I've made. Nicer for the university as well as for me if I could. I think that's pretty clear for a recently diagnosed upset autist who has just effectively gone non-verbal in an oral exam. This was the response. We all have a tendency to think we did worse than we did and to over-criticize ourselves. I am sure you have done better than you think. The examiner had previously said that they would give you an extra couple of minutes. Did you get this? You have made huge progress and you should be very proud of yourself. I know it's all very well for me to say, but try not to worry about your results until you receive them. You may well have done better than you think. Can you see the mismatch of salience? What do you think? What was the student saying and not saying? And what was the disability officer hearing and not hearing? Okay, you will have guessed by now that that student was me. Ach, pimia bring Gaelic gan triblish sambi, nor a harrute gan agamara, gajera, gafilanta, le blaspek sasanach, ach skoma. See what I mean? Here is what I would now send to the disability officer. Not at the end of the course, but near the beginning. The format of the oral exam means that the student is not being tested on their language skills, but on their ability to invent on the spot. The main problem for an autistic student divides into 2. 1, being put on the spot with no time to think, and 2, being expected to invent stuff that isn't literally true and isn't related in any way to their real life. We can't do that. We can't do it in our own language either. For example, the question, if you could invite anyone to dinner, who would it be? What would you talk about? And so on. My literal answer, which is quite short, is I don't know. I don't invite people to dinner. I don't know how you choose people, what people talk about, or how it's done. End of. Yes, given quite a bit of time, I could produce some kind of answer, but not in an extra couple of minutes. And I'd probably have to make notes to remember what I was going to say about such a difficult subject. The stress of trying to think up something to say when I have nothing to say means I have no brain left for getting the language right. An informal extra couple of minutes in silence on the phone when the parameters aren't clear simply adds to the stress. What is needed is the subject, by email for example, 5 minutes before the phone call. Enough time to think of something to say, not enough time to be writing out the text in advance. The language isn't the problem. What to say is. This was a student whose support needs, not being obvious, were completely ignored, indeed almost literally unheard. But with a couple of small changes, the experience would have been radically different. I'll just finish this session with some comments on disability. It can be hard for someone to admit they are not coping, that they need help, that they can't manage stuff that other people can manage. And it is absolutely true that autism comes with its advantages and strengths. I, for one, wouldn't be without it. I love my autistic brain and the autistic brains of my friends and colleagues. But if we don't face the fact that our difference disables us, we will spend our lives camouflaging, masking, and unsupported. We will not fulfill our potential, and we may burn out, or worse. There should be no stigma attached to disability if we see it from the point of view of the social rather than the medical model. We may have an impairment or a difference, but it is society that turns that into a disability. I am not disabled if I use a wheelchair, although I have an impairment. I am disabled because the building has neither ramp nor lift to provide me with access. I am not disabled because I am autistic, although I have a difference. I am disabled because you insist that I work in an open plan office with strip lighting and a radio playing all day. I can't do that. I am about as high functioning as it gets. But until I found my niche as a psychotherapist, autistic people have no empathy, eh? I was pretty much unemployable. I survived on artwork. Autistic people are so unimaginative, eh? Translating and transcribing, gardening, and minimum wage work as a carer. This is our story, and it should not be. It doesn't need to be, but it is society that needs to change. I could say a lot more on this, but I don't think I need to. As regarding physical disability at least, it is slowly becoming a bit more mainstream. The more we are out, the more we recognize our boundaries and red lines, the more we come to appreciate the way our brains work and start to play to our strengths, the less stressful living in this world, this society is. It is when we try to be what we are not that paradoxically we are most disabled. I hope that this video has given some idea what it is like to live in a world in which we are not the predominant neurotype, and why we might seem both less and more disabled than we really are.